October 1944. The ruins of a bombed village near Ericourt, France. Gray smoke drifts over pulverized stone walls and shattered timber beams. Every building is flattened. Every single human resident has evacuated weeks ago, leaving behind a ghost landscape of gray craters and cold mud. Boots crunch on broken glass. A four-star American general walks through the rubble, his staff following 2 paces behind. Suddenly, a tiny movement breaks the stillness. A small, orange tabby cat emerges from a collapsed cellar. It is thin, dusty, and trembling. The creature walks directly toward the general, stopping at his polished leather boots to rub its small flank against the leather. An aide steps forward, raising his hand to shoo the stray away. The general stops him instantly. He bends down, lifts the frail animal into his arms, and cradles it against his chest. What Patton did next surprised everyone who watched him. This is the story of what Patton did when a stray cat walked out of a destroyed village and rubbed against his boot. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the war he fought and the man he hid. Captain Thomas Vance, a 26-year-old from dynamic Chicago, served in the headquarters company of the Forward Third Army. Before enlisting, he worked as a quiet clerk in a local railway office, managing freight manifests. The war tore his world apart when an artillery shell struck his childhood home during the Blitz while he was training in England, killing his sister. He carried her faded photograph inside his wool uniform pocket, just over his chest. He was a man who understood sudden devastation, having seen his share of blood from Normandy to the fields of France. He knew how quickly a life or a home could vanish into a cloud of gray smoke. On this cold afternoon, Vance was tasked with surveying the perimeter of the flattened village, ensuring no hidden snipers remained in the cellars. That was when he saw the small orange shape moving through the dust. Lieutenant Donald Ross, a 29-year-old officer from Boston, managed the local supply depot nearby. He came from a family of wealth, boasting a family crest that dated back 3 centuries. His uniform was tailored, his leather boots gleamed without a speck of mud, and his silver insignias were polished to a mirror shine. Ross viewed the conflict through a lens of rigid military utility, believing that anything failing to contribute directly to firepower was a waste of army rations. He often remarked that sentimentality was a disease that slowed down the advance. He possessed a clean kitchen setup in his rear echelon tent, complete with fresh coffee and white porcelain mugs. To Ross, the war was a machine, and only the strong or the useful deserved a place in it. He stood near the edge of the rubble, watching the headquarters staff with a look of pure contempt as the small tabby cat stepped into the open lane. The Allied advance across France in the autumn of 1944 was a brutal, crushing machine. The Third Army moved with unprecedented speed, tearing through German defensive lines and leaving a trail of shattered steel and pulverized stone in its wake. In the Lorraine region, towns like Ericourt became fierce battlegrounds, where heavy artillery exchanges flattened entire blocks within hours. The relentless pace of the offensive meant that tactical commanders focused entirely on fuel, ammunition, and forward momentum. Supplies were stretched to the absolute limit, and every truck transport was strictly reserved for the instruments of war. In this environment of total mechanized destruction, civilian populations fled into the woods, leaving behind ghost towns where nothing could easily survive. Many officers in the rear echelons grew hardened to the wreckage around them. They learned to ignore the stray livestock, the ruined farms, and the domestic animals wandering through the craters. To these men, a wandering animal was merely a nuisance, a potential disease carrier, or a distraction from the cold mathematics of the daily advance. Subordinate commanders regularly ordered their men to clear out any stray creatures to keep camps orderly and focused. It was a common occurrence across the entire European theater, a minor detail completely overlooked in the grand theater of global conflict. The focus of the entire division was trained on the upcoming push toward the German border, making local encounters seem entirely insignificant to the high command. Yet, beneath the strategic planning and the cold maps, the reality of the front lines remained fixed on the immediate ground. The small orange creature continued its slow walk across the gravel, its presence drawing a sharp line between military precision and the raw debris of a broken country. Captain Vance walked toward the orange tabby cat, kneeling down in the pulverized stone. He reached out a hand, allowing the thin animal to sniff his fingers. The cat let out a faint, raspy mew and began rubbing its dusty head against his knuckles. Vance felt the animal trembling against the chill of the October wind. It was completely alone in the wreckage of the village. He knew he had to do something to help it survive. Lieutenant Ross stepped over a pile of shattered roof tiles, his polished boots clicking against the stones. He stared down at Vance with a look of intense disgust. His jaw tightened. "Get that filthy creature out of this sector, Captain," Ross said. "It is just a stray cat, Lieutenant," Vance replied, keeping his voice calm as he stroked the animal. "It survived the artillery barrage, but it is starving. I do not care if it survived a lightning strike," Ross said. "It is an unproductive drain on our presence here, and it has no military value to the Third Army." "The village is completely flattened," Vance said, looking up from the mud. "Everything living is gone, and this animal has nowhere else to go. This is a forward military area, not a sanctuary for stray beasts," Ross said, his voice rising with arrogance. "Sentimental garbage slows down the operational advance of our forces." "We have plenty of leftover rations in the rear supply trucks," Vance said. "A single tin of meat will not affect our movement toward the German border. Those rations belong to the United States Army, not to a piece of useless refuse from the ruins," Ross said. "My family has maintained discipline for 3 generations, and I will not permit a soft-hearted clerk to waste government property on a stray cat." "The regulation allow for local discretion regarding camp welfare," Vance said, standing up to face the lieutenant. "My discretion is the only rule that matters in this depot," Ross said, pointing a finger at the rubble. "If that creature is still in this sector in 5 minutes, I will have the guards throw it into the river. We do not support parasites." Vance realized the lieutenant was entirely fixed in his position, driven by a rigid sense of unearned entitlement. He knew arguing further would only endanger the small animal. He looked at the cat, then back at the polished uniform of the lieutenant. This matter was beyond his ability to resolve without escalating the conflict through the official chain of command. Vance picked up the trembling tabby cat, holding it securely against his wool jacket, and walked back toward the command tent. He immediately drafted an official report detailing the confrontation and the lieutenant's direct threat to the animal. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the supply depot within the hour. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory revolvers rested securely on his belt. The general walked in unannounced, his presence instantly causing every man in the tent to snap to attention. The room went completely silent. Patton studied the lieutenant for a cold, quiet moment before he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire space. "Are you the officer who threatened to drown a cat that survived the Aracourt barrage?" Patton asked. "Yes, General," Lieutenant Ross said, his voice tightening. "The animal has no military function and wastes valuable Army presence." "And you believe your personal standard of utility supersedes the survival of a creature in this theater?" Patton asked. "I believe discipline requires us to eliminate unproductive elements from our camps," Ross answered. Patton looked at the lieutenant's immaculate uniform, then down at the small orange tabby cat resting securely in Captain Vance's arms. He stepped forward, his boots clicking against the hard ground, his eyes fixed on the antagonist. "You stand here in a tailored uniform with a family crest, talking about what is productive in a war zone," Patton said. "You sit behind a clean kitchen with fresh coffee, while men are tearing through stone walls to break the German line. You have never crawled through the freezing mud of our artillery crater to preserve your own skin. This small creature stayed in a cellar, while an entire battalion worth of steel flattened every house in this village," Patton said. "It survived a barrage that would have broken the spirit of regular infantry units. It did not desert, it did not complain, and it did not beg for your permission to live. The Third Army respects survival because survival requires absolute strength. You possess an abundance of unearned privilege, yet you lack the basic respect for a determination that physically matches the very momentum we use to crush the enemy. You now have a clear choice. You will personally ensure this animal is fed 3 times a day from your own depot rations, and it will live at our main headquarters as a permanent member of our staff. If you refuse to support a creature that survived the Aracourt shelling, you will be reassigned to a forward rifle platoon in the next 10 seconds to see if your own utility matches its endurance. Decide now. Ross looked at the general's unwavering eyes, his face draining of color as his unearned arrogance completely broke. He lowered his head and nodded in silent compliance. The order was carried out immediately before the gathered personnel of the entire forward supply depot. Lieutenant Ross walked out into the gray afternoon chill, his immaculate leather boots splashing into the cold mud as he carried a heavy crate of military rations toward the rear of the command tent. Dozens of dirty mechanics, truck drivers, and infantrymen stopped their work to watch the wealthy officer labor under the weight of the boxes. The smell of damp earth and exhaust fumes filled the air as Ross opened a tin of meat, his hands shaking slightly under the cold gaze of the headquarters staff. He placed the food into a small dish near the map table, his face flushed with public humiliation. The orange tabby cat, now officially designated as headquarters personnel, stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements. It ignored the lieutenant completely and began to eat, its small throat vibrating with a raspy, steady purr. The witnesses watched in absolute silence, recognizing the physical reversal of power that had just occurred in the camp. An arrogant officer had been forced to serve a creature he had deemed entirely worthless, his pride completely dismantled in front of the men he commanded. Captain Vance went home to Chicago after the war ended, returning to his quiet railway office in the late autumn of 1945. He lived a long and peaceful life, rarely discussing the violence he witnessed in Europe, but he kept the faded photograph of his sister on his nightstand until his death in 1984. The memory of that dusty village stayed with him forever. Lieutenant Ross served out the remainder of his deployment in the rear supply echelons, his rapid advancement permanently halted by the official report filed in his permanent record. He returned to Boston in 1946, where he took over his family estate and lived in quiet, bitter isolation until his passing in 1978. He never spoke to his peers about his assignment in the Lorraine campaign or the general who had shattered his unearned pride. General Patton never mentioned the incident in his public journals, but he kept the detailed supply depot report tucked away inside a locked drawer in his personal field desk for the remainder of his life. He reportedly told a close confidant during the winter campaign that a man who cannot recognize the fierce determination to survive in a helpless creature has no business directing the fate of human soldiers on a battlefield. Some historians have argued that General Patton's unexpected decision to adopt the stray animal was a calculated public relations gesture, designed to soften his terrifying reputation among the press corps and humanize his harsh command style during a difficult campaign. They claim that an officer managing thousands of combat casualties could not afford genuine distractions from the tactical maps. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that the incident was a rare, unscripted glimpse into a deeply hidden personal compassion, proving that his aggressive nature respected resilience wherever it was found. What is certain is that the orange tabby cat remained at the Third Army headquarters until the German surrender, outlasting many veteran battalions. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have left the animal behind to stay focused purely on the military advance? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the war he fought and the man he hid, make sure to subscribe.